And here we go.
Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Tamika Miller. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Events at the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce. I'm delighted to close out today's FAIR workshops with another good presentation, how to take advantage of your knowledge of a diverse and inclusive workplaces. So how to take advantage of your knowledge of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. How do you take advantage of that? How do you know if the place that you are considering working is going to be diverse and inclusive? So our presenter, Meredith Levert, who is a senior consultant with the HR Source, will be talking with you through that. And so without further ado, I welcome Meredith. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Tamika. Good afternoon, everybody. Certainly is a pleasure to be able to present before you all today. Want to really set the stage that I want you to think about as candidates are seeking employment. What do you need to know about diversity and inclusion? What I find is that it's a much overused term, and people don't necessarily know what it means. So we're gonna really explore that. What you see up on the screen is just a few things about me. So, because in your back of your mind, you might be going like, oh, well, why should I listen to her? Well, I've got a lot of background in this area. That doesn't mean a lot, but it means that I also have one interface with employers and organizations, and I do a lot of work around this notion of diversity, inclusion, and equity work. So, I'm in an industry that allows me to really look at leaders and look at what hiring managers are looking for. So I am a senior consultant at HR Source. It's a boutique consulting firm located in Landover, Maryland, with an office in New Haven, Connecticut. So we do a lot of work in this area of HR, diversity management, and community work. So let's look at where we're going to focus on today. So here's some objectives for the session, just so we know where we're going to have our focus. So we know that diversity, inclusion, and equity is important, and it's also important to not only employees, but also to organizations. So as I mentioned before, oftentimes people use these terms and they're really not sure what the definition is. So we're going to look at what are some of the definitions of those associated terms, and also what do they produce in terms of result. And lastly, as a job applicant, what do you need to know? And what questions do you need to ask to determine if the organization you're really seeking has a level of commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? So, here's what happens. I keep hearing about DEI in my job search, but what is DEI? Well, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what do those mean? So, as a savvy job seeker, I'm sure you have often been encountered by this DEI. Most organizations, it's like the old days, or sometimes still organizations that we're an EEO employer. What does that really mean? So this is what's interesting. A lot of organizations throw that term around. However, diversity, we're seeing that diversity oftentimes hasn't really been achieved in a lot of organizations, not to the degree that we think is profitable or certainly gets them the results they're looking for. So diversity, what is it? Well, here's the key terms around it. Diversity is, bottom line, it's all the ways that people are different. So that includes dimensions such as race, ethnicity, age, gender, class, and a sexual orientation, age, and also the ways that you think and approach things. Notice that most of the time when people talk about diversity, they really look at it in terms of race and gender, but it's really much broader than that. So let's start to take that broader look. So what you see here is what we call the dimensions of diversity. And if you notice that there's some things that are called primary, and that's like your personality, and then there's other things that are associated with age and race and ability and gender. And those are the things that are what we're really kind of hardcore wired for. And they're part of who we are. We can't really change them. They're really part of who we are. But you'll notice if you go up, another band of diversity is really around, parenting style, parents, where you were born, the geography of where you're born, pay, salary, all of those things are also places where people can be treated differently. And then lastly, if you start looking at the type of work, if you're management or if you're union or any of those designations. So here's the point I want you to realize is that your diversity is always showing. And not only is that all of us have intersectionality, which just means our diversity shows up in just not one dimension, but in several dimensions. So I can be have an ethnicity of Irish, and I can also be transgendered, and I also could be in an occupation where you don't see a lot of people who are transgendered. So I may have 3 different areas of diversity that shows up for me. So bottom line, diversity is just not one thing. So there's some realities about diversity, and this is what I call a reality check, because we know that there are organizations that look at and propose diversity, and at the same time, they don't have the kind of results that they're looking to have. And so when we talk about results, here's what companies who are part of what we call the top 50 diversity companies report that are the reasons why they choose diversity. 1, it allows them oftentimes to have access to different language skills, different points of view are more openly expressed when you have a more diverse employment area. There's translation of values into practices, there's increased productivity, and there's improved customer-based solutions. So if you think about that wheel, including also customers, then you get innovation and you get a lot of deployment of effective teams. So that's the result. So why diversity is needed within our workplace? Well, if you look at some results that came up from the 1918 Workforce Diversity Report, here's some things that start to show up. Half of the U.S. population, or the workforce, is white. 39% is Asian, 5.7 is Hispanic Latino, 3.3 is African American, and 2.5 is percentages are identified with people that say they want 2 or more races. And so less than 1% identifies what we call other. So if we put this into national perspective, more than 13% of the U.S. population is African American, and yet only a little bit less than in the workplace, a little bit less than that is representative in workplaces. So 3.3 versus 13%. So what's happening? Why are people of color in particular often having lower percentages of representation inside of workplaces than our percentage inside of a population? So organizations need diversity. Inclusion. What is inclusion? And I really like this particular slide because I think that this says it all. In inclusion, either I'm a part of or I'm a part from. And at the bottom of the line, at the bottom of the bottom line is that inclusion really involves us, all of us. But here's another working definition for inclusion. Inclusion really means to consider everyone's background, your thought process, your opinions when assessing a situation or idea. So why might employers need that? Well, what we found is when you have a broader array of thoughts and opinions coming to the table, you will usually end up with a better product or a better idea or a more innovative product. So inclusion is really that sense that people belong, that people have a feeling that they're respected and that they're valued for who they are as an individual. And you have a feeling that is really levels your supportive energy and is also a commitment from others that you can do your best work. And so oftentimes in the past, employers have said, kind of leave who you are at the door. Well, inclusion really invites you to bring everything around who you are into the workplace. So in order to have an inclusive work environment, we need to have inclusive leadership. And so when you're in your job search, ask the question about inclusion. So what are some of the inclusive leadership patterns that you see in organization? Because if there's this pattern, guess what? That leader is really making that bridge from just diversity, because oftentimes most workplaces have and display racial and gender diversity, but inclusion is really that bridge that gets us to the full impact of people performing and feeling that they're valued. So you can ask some questions about what's the level of inclusive leadership in the organization. Is there a demonstrated way that leaders get evaluated relative to the D&I that they produce in their work groups? Do they have the real courage to speak up and challenge the status quo? Do they have some way of recognizing their own bias? Because guess what? All of us, every single one of us has some form of bias, not to be confused with prejudice or discrimination, but bias. And it's just this automatic way we oftentimes of looking at the world, and we're kind of oblivious to the fact that bias is there. All of us need that curiosity, but managers especially need to be pretty open-minded and really encourage people to be curious. We need to have what we call cultural intelligence. Leaders really need to be confident and effective in their cross-cultural interactions. So that means that they should know how to work with a variety of people from a variety of backgrounds. And then lastly, there needs to be this notion of collaboration. So leaders' greatest power is when they can bring together individuals and really create an environment where everybody feels free to collaborate and create that exceptional product. So what's the reality check around inclusion if you look at organizations? Well, this is what they report about inclusion, that it assists the leader in explaining and seeing how diversity plays out in the organization. So they can see when I have different groups and different ages and different backgrounds and geographical locations, I have to start understanding that not everybody sees the world the same way. They've got to be able to expand their recruiting resources and their network. So those are good questions to always ask. Where do you recruit? Where do you invest in sourcing people? Inclusion also encourages the managers, the leaders, to connect with people as a person, which is very, very important. No one wants to go to any employer and feel like you're just another clog in the wheel. Everybody likes to know that somebody knows who they are and what they're interested in. Inclusion also helps us to raise those questions as to who is not being included when we look around the table. Is everybody's voice being heard? And we also ask managers to confront what we call their own story about who has the right skills, the right ability, and the right experience. Because if people don't question that, we'll see that we get a repeat in terms of who gets hired and who gets listened to. So equity, and this is kind of a new term, and a lot of people are not familiar with it. And they go like, what's equity? Does that mean that everybody should be treated equally? Well, not necessarily. So we're not suggesting that people, get treated badly. What we are saying is that not everyone can be treated the same. And some of you might have sibling, or some of you may even have some children. And the question is, does everybody get treated the same? So think about that for a second. If you treat everybody the same, then you don't recognize and certainly acknowledge that everybody has a different way of approaching things. We have differences around how we see the world. And you might have grown up in a household and have sibling, and guess what? I would bet not every one of you see the world the same way. And so that's the fallacy of treating people the same. And what we encourage people to do is to treat people according to who they are. So equity really asks us to acknowledge that everyone has different needs, have different experiences, and may be created to respond to different opportunities. Equity really inspires that we look at these different identities and we look at the barriers that prevent people from being able to bring their best self to work. So, what is diversity success? We've talked a lot about it. So, this is one of the things that organizations say. When we have racial and ethnic diversity, companies are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. So for gender diverse teams, that's about 5% more than their likely results would have been without it. Companies with above average diversity have a 19% higher innovation revenues. So when you're an employer, innovation is the key to what everybody is looking for today. And 19% increase puts you in some rare air. Companies with the most ethical and cultural diverse boards ethnically, I'm sorry, I said ethically, the most ethnically and cultural diverse boards worldwide are 43% more likely to experience higher profits. So this says that the organization really needs to look from top to bottom. So it's at the board level down to the lowest level employee. So question again for you to ask, what is the composition of your board? What does your board look like? How committed are they to diversity? What are some of the activities that they've undertaken? For diverse teams, 3 or more people outperform individual decision makers up to 87% of the time. That's a pretty earth-shaking figure, because one of the fallacies that we've worked with in workplaces is the notion that the smart boss. And so guess what? Bosses and leaders get smarter when they include other people because they can utilize those experiences. So bottom line, diversity and inclusion produces results that count. We've already talked about that. Increased employee engagement, and every employer is looking for that. Greater profitability and productivity, enhanced employee development, positive organizational culture, improved retention, and stronger customer relationships. So for most organizations, the major goal of their organizational and their leader is related to diversity, inclusion, equity, because the job of the organization today, 4 main things. Not an organization that's doing business of some sort is not attached to these 4 things. You got to be able to attract people. You got to be able to identify talent. You've got to be able to retain that talent. And then you've got to develop them once you get them. And so this picture really shows you that today employers are faced with a bigger and more complex picture of where they need to go to be able to do that. And it's just not one type of person, one gender of persons, and one geographical place or one school. And if the smart employers are constantly expanding that picture to include more and more differences. Next. So what's the evidence that organizations are committed to diversity? So there's a number of things that you need to look for as a savvy job seeker. When organizations demonstrated they're conscious about managing diversity, equity, and inclusion, they, 1, make DEI a visible part of the organization. And the best way for organizations to do that is to include it in their mission and vision statement. So if I was looking for an organization I was interested in, first thing I would do is go look at what does their mission and vision statement say. They also might demonstrate it by how they visually represent diversity at their organization at every level. So in the today, where most people use a lot of social media, who makes up their organization? What do they look like? Do they have pictures of people who have a disability? Do they have a picture of somebody in a wheelchair or signing? So what is their diversity? How do they demonstrate that? In talking about how diversity looks out inside of the organization, you might ask them, so how does diversity here show up? What's the most driving force around diversity? And for example, you might want to think about that in terms of communications, as I said, in social media. What kind of pronouns do they use? Are they even aware that there's different preferences for pronouns besides just he and she? Is there some kind of visual representation, again, of employees? And does that carry over into who they advertise with? And also business publications. Does it give an accurate visual portrayal of the organization? Next. No one you encounter in your job search in a really truly diverse organization should shy away or be reluctant to talk about DEI in the organization. So if someone just kind of says, yeah, we have that, you might want to push them and ask them more in-depth questions, because it may not really reveal a level of commitment. Recruitment is really focused in organizations who really practice DEI. And they put an emphasis on diversity as being an important part of their organization's success. Again, they're not shy to say, we're actively seeking, employees who have had this kind of background, or who are doing this, or who are doing that. Is there training made available to leadership or to employees? Has the organization invested in training to teach people how to be more effective in working in diverse environments? Do people within the organization display a comfort level talking about race, gender, GLBTI kind of concerns, as well as disability and age? Does the organization have a DEI council or committee, which is comprised of employees from every level of the organization that gives input into that initiative? Not just driven from top down or bottom up, but an organization that's truly representative of all the employees. Does the organization have an active, and this should be not infinity, but affinity groups? And that just says that if you have an affinity for a particular group, so let's say that you are part of the LGBTI community and you really want to have a conversation with other people that identify that way, that the organization gives you some space to have that. Or if you're over 60 and you want to just have conversations with people who are in that age range about your work experience, that would be examples of an affinity group. Does leadership have goals that are associated with their overall performance? So do managers get assessed on diversity? That can go anywhere from, do they have inclusive teams, to what kind of activities they do with their teams around the idea of diversity. Have their leaders been trained to understand their role in ensuring that all employees are engaged and feel included? Their policies and procedures, have they attributed and been audited to ensure that they have there's culturally supported of DEI? How is talent identified and developed here? And that's a great question to ask, because one of the things that I see is the organizations are really trying to engage in this idea about how to you develop people once they get aboard. Ask about the development. What diverse vendors does the organization do business with? So do they go out and source diverse suppliers and vendors? That's a good indication also of their commitment. What is the diversity composition of the board that we talked about, and senior leadership as well? Has the organization taken a look at any social justice issues? especially given what we've seen occur in the last year. And what's been the organization's biggest challenge relative to DEI? And that's a great question for you to ask. So here's what you might want to consider. That diversity is more than just what the organization is doing, but you also have a responsibility in this. So you might want to also think about, how diverse are how competent are you around diversity and cultural competence? Have you worked with different kinds of people? Have you worked with people who have an intellectual disability? Or have you always worked with people who are considered as the high potential individuals? So what is your cultural competency? Have you personally managed your own story about diversity and inclusion? So if your story is, that's just a bunch of BS and, it's one way for one group to get ahead, you might want to check your story. How did you get your story? Admit and stay aware of one of your biases, at least one. We all have many, but just one. So am I more prone to want to work with younger people versus older people, or do I believe older people can't learn technology? So whatever it may be, check out your own biases. Master becoming more inclusive. Are you a person who is willing to meet new people, find out more about different cultures? Be personally committed to other people's success. That's the best way to be inclusive in an organization, because your success is oftentimes tied into a team. Notice what you say, and more importantly, what you don't say about diversity and inclusion and equity inside of an organization. Address anything that you see that looks like it's overt discrimination and exclusionary behavior. Be transparent, and most of all, be authentic. Keep learning and have a plan to read and listen and talk to increase your own knowledge, and move out of your comfort zone. Get comfortable being uncomfortable, and be prepared to make mistakes, because you learn from those. So I want you to do what I'm going to call a little bit of reflection. We've covered a lot in relatively short time. So take a moment to consider what's your personal role as a new employee in helping contribute to a diverse and inclusive workplace. Consider, what can you do to build and support a culture of inclusion within your sphere of influence? And even as a new employee, you have one. What new behaviors are you committed to developing and displaying going forward? And then what I'd like for you to do is take a second, write down what you believe you might have learned today that you can use in your employment search. And I'll give you a few seconds to do that, and then I'll entertain any questions. So let you write down what you might have learned, and you can share that with us through chat. I see there is a chat question. It says, in my observation, do I feel companies are serious about diversity and inclusion, or is it a good slogan for the moment? Well, I think that varies company to company. I think there's some companies where that's just a slogan, and I think that there are other companies that are extremely committed to making sure that they have diversity and inclusion. I think those smart organizations who recognize that has led to some very powerful results have been willing to face the challenge. And that's exactly why I would say to you, utilize those list of questions, because you'll be able to determine whether or not somebody's just doing it and it's just a slogan, as opposed to if there's a real commitment. Do we have any what you learned. It just can be 1 or 2 words. And if you didn't learn nothing, you can say nothing. So I see that one attendee says, if you're applying for a job, how would you answer their question from an employer interview that asks, what have you done to foster diversity and inclusion? And how will you do that if we hire you? That's a great question. So that's why I had, if you go back and think about that other slide, then where I said, you should come being diversity ready also as a candidate. So it might have been, I've read some books. I think there's a lot of opportunity now, especially in light of last year when we had a lot of things that came up around this notion of social justice. So it could be, gee, I've spent some time doing, my own research, reading, getting exposure to different views. I've learned a lot about a lot of organizations are talking about becoming anti-racist. I've learned what that term means. I've applied myself to get some different perspectives. I had never realized that people, can be discriminated against. And I've gone to YouTube and looked at some of those lectures about how people have had different life experiences. So I think that there's places, and so if I come into your workplace, I have a different view of what it looks like to work with diversity. Not going to always be perfect at it, but at least I'm at a different place than what I was when I started out. Is it possible to contact me offline? I suppose so. We can make that happen. So I'm not sure on I've answered those live. Is people were able to hear me? Is that correct? Great. Thank you, Tamika. Any other questions? So, if you would like to get hold of me offline, I'll put my email address in the chat. The only thing that I would ask is that in contacting me, please tell me where we had the pleasure of connecting. So all I got to do is say I was part of the online session. Thank you. I see we have another chat for attendee who said it was very informative presentation. Thank you. I appreciate that. So let me ask you a question for everybody. And this has to do with what I call good feedback. I appreciate that it was informative. What about it informed your thinking? If you could help me out there. Um, so this is why I ask people about what they learned. I learned that, employers, I can ask employers questions. I learned that I could certainly um, ask them specific questions about their level of commitment to diversity or where they use their resources. Those are specific kinds of questions. Okay, thank you. I heard from one of the panelists, and they said, I think we need to actually discuss this rather than submit questions. So I'm open to try and discuss that as much as we can with the remaining time. If there's anything you'd like to specifically discuss. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to focus on the final slide that I have in my presentation. And I always like to adjourn with like a final thought. And my final thought is from Max Dupree, who's really a jazz artist. But I love this quote he had. He said, "We need to give each other the space to grow, to be ourselves, to exercise our diversity. We need to give each other the space so that we can both give and receive such beautiful things such as ideas, openness, dignity, joy, healing, and inclusion." And I really think that that's so much of what needs to happen if we really provide that space for each other. Um, it allows us to get to know people, and in getting to know people, we can experience that openness, and we can experience that respect and dignity and a feeling of being included.
So hello.
Hello.
So if there are no other questions, then I will just close it up by saying, Meredith Levert, we thank you so much
Thank you.
for presenting today. Again, she's a senior consultant from the HR Source. And I did see that several people have been telling me it's been an informative session. So I thank you, Meredith, and thank you for putting your contact information in the chat.
Sure.
If you want to reach out to Meredith, please do. And please, as a reminder, as Meredith said, let her remind her of how you interacted or how she interacted with you. And then I want to quickly let you all know we have more programming and planning coming up tomorrow, starting at 10 o'clock in the morning on the Hoover platform. So we ask you to join us then. We'll be talking about a series of different workshops. And also we'll be emailing all of you, if you have not received already, you'll be receiving a digital program. Everyone who's registered will receive a digital program that will give you the full lineup for the workshops for tomorrow and Thursday. So with that, we will close out today. And again, thank you, Meredith, and thank you
Thank
all for
you.
tuning in today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.